Welcome to this week's edition of Done and Dusted. I'd like to start by welcoming my fellow podcaster, Darren Mort, family law barrister, author, filmmaker, award-winning. I'm Caroline Council, your host. We're really lucky this week to have the most wonderful Dee-vna Haslam joining us from the Queensland University of Technology. Clinical psychologist, but interesting for today's discussion, you also hold an honorary position at the Parenting and Family Centre of Queensland. Dee-vna, is that right?
Yes, the Parenting and Family Support Centre at the University of Queensland, which is 30 years of research with parents and children.
Fantastic. And your experience as a clinical psychologist comes to bear in relation to that role as well. And as usual, we are very interested to talk about the impact of, and our world is around separation and how separating parents who do it badly or parents who don't have insight in relation to their behaviour, how that sets children up both short-term and long-term to have real problems around that separation piece, but also dysfunctional or, at worst, violent separations, which can obviously impact adversely on children. So you would obviously see that in your line of work, Dee-vna.
Yeah, so I do mostly research these days. I've got a long history of clinical practice as well. But I think what the key message is that parents' interactions with children across the board have a really big impact on how children develop. So when parents are in homes that are conflictual and are difficult and they're yelling at each other and they're stressed, that has a detrimental impact on children. In the converse, when you have parents that are loving and stable and their own needs for mental health and well-being and relationship and connection are met, they're better able to kind of connect with their children. And so what we see, I think, in separations and divorce, particularly if they're more acrimonious, which are probably the ones that you're more likely to come across in your line of work, is the kind of exacerbation of that influence, because parents are under probably the most extreme stress that they're ever under. And, their resources are taken up by everything else that's going on. So they're not always able to react calmly and put the child first.
And the one thing we're not fans, or we tend to avoid doing, is talk about compromised parenting at that point in time. So the focus is really about, what are my rights? What sort of time am I going to be spending with the child? Whereas we don't really turn the lens, not until we're in court, and then it's sort of a backward-looking lens, which really doesn't help the children. We talk about, what you did wrong 2 years ago or 3 years ago. So how do we shift parents from being parent-centric to child-centric? What would you say the research teaches us about how to do things better?
Yeah, first of all, I just love the fact that you're child-centric because, putting the child at the centre does take away all of that my side or your side and the kind of arguments over who's right or who's wrong, and it takes away all of that blaming. And it puts it instead on what's going to be best for the child. And we know from decades of evidence that what is best for the child is parents that are able to engage calmly and lovingly with children and that are able to focus on what the child actually needs. And so it's about getting the parents to see and I would probably avoid getting to see the negative impact of their behaviour by and large if possible, but to see the positive impact. So let's say, for example, you have two parents that are kind of arguing, not enormously acrimoniously, but to the point that I want full-time custody and the other person wants full custody. If we can get those parents on the same page of, do you want what's best for your child, irrespective of what that is, what would be the benefit for your child? And if you can get the mum to say, well, if my child felt that we were working together, that they were able to have both parents doing what's best for them, that would be really positive. And then you get the other parent and you're like, what would be the benefit for your child if you're able to do that? And even that question of what would be best for the child, I think will get parents thinking a little bit differently, because I would imagine that most people come to family lawyers with what's best for me rather than what the impact on my child.
Now, interestingly, the other thing that Darren and I do, he represents independent children's lawyers who look after the needs of children in court disputes. But Darren and I are also mediator trained. So, Darren, I'd imagine that what you were hearing from Dee-vna just then really resonated with you. So, is this something that you are able to shift parents in the conversations you have with them when you're mediating with them?
Yes, I do. I think it's really important to validate parents' concerns, number one. I think it's important for them to understand what their child is actually saying and to listen to their child and to observe their child. I think thirdly, it's really important for the parents to have thought about how they might co-parent and finally join those plans together and work a pathway forward if they possibly can for the benefit of the child. What I'm having trouble with at the moment, Dee-vna, and you might help me with this, is this. If you've got let's use a mother, for example. If you've got a mother who is struggling with the trauma of the parental separation and the children are picking up on her anxieties, um, putting in place a pathway forward how to best manage that, is it parent-centric to say that that mother should focus on getting herself back on track before it moves to being more child-centric, or is it all part of the same concept? You know what I'm saying? It's like the aeroplane, the oxygen mask come down, the parent puts it on first before the child. And I just find that what you said before, I just find that really difficult to come to terms with.
Yeah, and I think the thing is, it's in some cases it's not parent centric or child centric. Sometimes you do need to focus on both. So if you're acting in the best interests of the child, really the best interest of the child is a parent who's actually able to look after their own mental health and have their needs met as well. So I would argue by encouraging those parents to seek additional support external to what's going on in the court system will actually benefit the child. So in that sense, it is beneficial for the child and it is kind of child centric. So it's about holding the kind of mutuality of the different goals and where the goals coalesce, which is the child having access to stable parents that are not going to fly off the handle and are not going to overreact or are not going to be, engaging in excessive substances and things like that, then I do think it's good for the parent to be able to engage in that support. And I think that's consistent with child views.
Yeah, yeah, great. Yeah, that certainly makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Because often we have cases where we're exposed to parents who have undergoing trauma, and of course the court process continues with that trauma, multifaceted trauma. But what Caroline said before about mediation, getting back to that question, I think the things that I highlighted were really important from my point of view dealing with parents. How do you deal with it, Caroline?
Look, I think you made a great point as well, Darren, that if you don't actually identify what it is that the parent is saying, if you don't deal with that, they will pay lip service to the concept that they're recognizing what's in the best interest of the child, but then they will literally undermine at every turn the conversations that are then trying to put flesh on the bones of, well, what does look right for this child or children? What is okay for this particular sibling group? So I think you do have to hasten slowly with some people who ruminate over, what went wrong and who did what to whom. And you have to acknowledge, but you have to get them to let go and move on. And then I think you need to have that robust conversation about what is truly in the best interests of children, not just the fantasy that's in the parent's head about themselves and their own capacity, particularly with trauma, because unless somebody is actually able to say, look, I was in a bad place, I've moved on, I've had the counselling, if they're trying to make decisions whilst they're in the grips of trauma, they don't necessarily and don't want to acknowledge the impact of their own behaviour on the child. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and they
Yeah,
probably don't.
over to you.
Sorry, I'm jumping at the bit. The other thing is some of these parents just don't have capacity to actually take themselves out of what's going on for them and to put themselves in the child's view and to think about things from those different perspectives. So, on one hand, we say the best practice is to try and get parents to put their child first and to think about it from all different points of view rather than coming to things with a predetermined view of what's best for the child. But it does also require a high level of skills to be able to put aside all the emotional drama of what's gone on in the marriage and the marriage breakdown and to be able to approach it a bit more matter-of-factly. And I would suspect in your practice, you've seen families that have done that very well. I mean, we know clinically that divorce in itself is not a poor indicator for child outcome. It's poorly handled divorce, which is the poor indicator, and that seems to be having the big impact. When parents are able to do it calmly and rationally and co-parent successfully, the children do better. But a lot of parents don't have that capacity in the moment.
Yeah, and we have to move them on, don't we, Darren? We have to move them past the blame game and into what does a great outcome look like? How do we? And I think it's really interesting if you start to paint vignettes that resonate with the client. There's, depending, of course, on what religion you might adhere to, how do you want your child to remember Diwali? How do you want them to remember Christmas? How do you want them to remember a significant event? The other vignette, Darren, I sometimes use is, imagine your eldest child's gone away on a gap year. Let's fast forward 5 years. Do you want that child to come back as an adult and see both the two of you at the airport and go, oh my God, they're both here? Or do you want that child to throw their arms around both of you and say, Dad, Mum, it's great to see you both? So what you do now will literally write the outcome for how that vignette plays out. So sometimes I get them to imagine, like use your brain to go from stuck and blame to creating a better, more positive outcome for a child.
Yeah, I saw it without mentioning names, of course. I saw a client today, a father, and he has not seen his, I'll make up an age, 9-year-old child for a year. He hadn't particularly bonded with this child, and I get the impression the child didn't really attach to him because of the absences, but nonetheless, the child knows him as his father, and it seems that there was a relationship there, at least up until a year ago. And there has been some violence in the matter, some pushing and shoving, which appears, I'm not excusing it, but it was situational. And everyone's gone on with their lives, and the mother appears to be very enmeshed, or the child is very enmeshed with the mother. And you've got to wonder, Dee-vna, you've got to wonder what that mother is thinking. In terms of what Caroline just said too, the airport thing where your child sees both parents, you've got to think what that mother is thinking, how she can possibly perceive that emotionally, psychologically, and developmentally, it's going to enhance her child, that is, the boy without having any relationship with his father whatsoever. So I'm interested in your comments on that in relation to repercussions, that sort of thing, because Caroline and I see that a lot of times, and my heart goes out to those little kids, because what do they know? What do they really know?
Yeah, and it's a tricky one too, because in the situation that you've described, there doesn't sound like there's been, other than a few instances of violence, and absolutely that's not ideal. But where there's kind of a withdrawal of attention rather than active, emotional abuse, for example, I do think there's a lot more room for being able to open it up and be able to mend fences and reattach that relationship or reform that relationship. And I mean, even then, you've got a child that's growing up with an absent parent, and that's not ideal. But, if that parent is willing to be a part of the life, then maybe taking small steps where the child can then develop that relationship and have that positive relationship over time is going to be beneficial. But what the mum has to do is actually allow that to happen and to see any potential benefit for the child, because she's probably not going to see that, and it's understandable given, the history.
Yeah, and so the court's a very poor resource when that comes to play, because the law is the law. And if one judge that I was in the case said, well, if you can't get the child to go, madam, it doesn't give me much choice, because the child's got a right to a meaningful relationship with both parents. So, of course, the child has to go to the father, which means a huge emotional impact for the child, because what does the child know? I mean, you can't blame the child for the fact the mother can't get him there. It's her responsibility, and unless there's some huge amount of violence or some other really significant reason, the child should be going. So the law's a pretty bad servant when that's a pretty bad master, rather, when that's where that's concerned. And it's really a science thing, but it's really hard, Caroline, isn't it?
Yeah, well, there's not enough glue at the moment. There's nobody building those bridges to enable that child to walk across. So to me, this is really where, Dee-vna, we rely on psychologists to basically say this is dysfunctional, but it is not impossible. And I think it's being able to demonstrate that, the bridge is one step at a time. So if they can start to demonstrate capacity for the child to be okay in having that bridge back to dad, once you can demonstrate that the world will not end, the child will not be scarred, the child will not be injured psychologically by dad, and once dad has demonstrated he will be supporting that bridge and holding that bridge up, he will make the bridge work, then mum has to trust the process. But again, Darren's right. A set of orders has no magic in it. A set of orders has to be enforced. So how would, and we know how psychologists can be real game changers in that space. We know that they can start to build capacity of belief. So it worries us that we often interact or work with psychologists from a reporting perspective rather than a therapeutic perspective.
Yeah.
And I think if you're talking about long-term sustainable change that is child-centric, child-focused, it has to come from the therapeutic model. Dee-vna, just interested to hear your reflections on that.
No, I think that's 100% true, because it takes a while in any relationship to build up trust and confidence and be willing to be vulnerable. And you really need to do that in order to change and to grow. And you can't do that in a couple of hours of assessment for a court report. And so you do need to actually have that kind of sustained ongoing relationship and change. That there was an old painting, and it doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen at some stage if you keep at it. And, psychologists will do motivational interviewing, and they'll work with parents about what's the goals here, what do you need to do, what are you doing really well, let's enhance that and strengthen that, coming at it from a skills-based model. But also, where do we go from here, and how do you kind of build that bridge that you were talking about, Caroline, so that the child is going to be okay, and that everybody involved in this family situation can benefit over time. And of course, there are exceptional circumstances where there's been, abuse and things like that, where it may not be as beneficial. But in a lot of cases, I think parents come to the courts and to separation with their own baggage rather than as much baggage or concerns about the child. And it's getting them to put that child in the centre that's really kind of going to be key.
And yet they internally think, but I am. This is why I'm so worried. I am putting the child centre. And you're going, no, you're actually not. And it even makes it very hard for Darren and me if we're acting for one of those people that protests and says, but I am. And we're going, we actually think you're about to have the Riot Act read to you by the court because we don't think you're actually doing enough. our job is also to put our client's best case forward. It's interesting we're having this conversation in March 2024 because, of course, we're about to have a major overhaul to the parenting law under the Family Law Act commencing on the 6th of May this year. And it's going to be very much more centric around the child and what the child needs based on the individual facts of a given case, but also with an emphasis on family violence. So the parent is less injected into the scenario than the child. The government has tried to take the parent-centric elements out and make it very much child-centric. But how do you deal with somebody, Dee-vna, this is again a question for you, how do you deal with somebody who has little insight or adheres to a worldview where they think they're doing the right thing? How do you sift them?
Look, it's difficult, and it kind of requires some cognitive challenging. Is let's look at the evidence for and against this. What do we know about having positive relationships with both parents, for instance? I can think of a case where there was a mother who black and blue swore to me that any contact with the ex-partner at all was going to be detrimental, and certainly not with the ex-partner's new partner. No violence, no emotional abuse, no other types of abuse. The only thing was potentially he may have had an affair, and even that wasn't verified. But, the data on the ground was actually the child had a loving, stable relationship with the dad. Both of the children, the elder one that was the case in question, and the younger one really wanted to maintain that relationship and actually wanted to be, loving and connected to the new partner as well. And the mum thought beyond all shadow of a doubt that having any contact with the dad was going to be detrimental. And so it's kind of gradually, questioning those viewpoints and checking out if they're really true or not. And that's a process that takes time and commitment from the parent as well. So there's no magic bullet, and I don't envy you trying to do it in this kind of where you're half lawyer, half psychologist, and half child advocate. It's a really tough gig.
So you need to surround yourselves, we need to surround ourselves with people who know what they're doing, like yourself, who are educated, experienced in the field. That's the most. I had the client I had today. I said, "Look, we're building a building here. We need to put some proper scaffolding around it. You pay peanuts, you get monkeys. We've got to have a good team on board. We've got to get a risk assessment done. We've got to get this done. We've got to get that done. It's all going to take time and money, but at the end of the day, at least you will have put your best case forward to the court, because it's hard, Dee-vna, because you act for some of these parents, and in a therapeutic process, it does take time because there's no magic. I have to laugh when lawyers go, "Oh, we'll have 6 weeks of this time, and we'll have another 3 weeks of that time." I mean, what the hell? I just don't get it. There's no social science that backs up that sort of nonsense. But us lawyers putting on our psychologist caps, some very badly, think that that's the solution. So it's very hard for fathers, for example, if I can use that example, who have not seen the child for a long time and need to go through this therapeutic process to appease the mother, to cognitively challenge her that everything's okay. It's very hard for the patient parent watching this child grow up and missing out on important time with that child whilst this is happening. So it's really hard to be child-centric in those circumstances, isn't it?
Yeah. And I mean, I think you've got to also take the mother's view into account in that she probably is genuinely worried. Can I send this child off with haven't seen them for a year? Do they trust them? What are they going to know how to help them if they, need their asthma puffer, all those kind of things. So it's about kind of listening to each parent and really hearing where they're at with things and then questioning the parts that maybe aren't true. And, in psychology, we talk about behavioral experiments. So what if we set up an environment where dad came over for 2 hours and you just see how he goes and how the child is by the end of it. And probably the child will be doing a little bit better than she's anticipating at that stage. And that kind of gives her some evidence from the child's point of view of how things are going to unfold.
Yeah, absolutely. Seeing is believing, isn't it?
Um,
No. Yeah,
Oh,
because
that,
we get these cases a lot of times. Say the worst cases, so some of the worst cases we see sexual abuse allegations, and
mm,
you send a report writer, even when the child hasn't seen the abuser, the alleged abuser, for months at a time. The observation session comes in, and the child's exposed to the purported abuser and runs lovingly into their arms. And it's very telling, those situations. I mean, that's one extreme, but it's very telling. Those observation sessions can be very interesting in a courtroom environment, but very
mm.
interesting in a therapeutic environment too.
Yeah.
But also from the anxious parent's perspective, Dee-vna, that would be like the antithesis of what they want for that child.
Yeah.
They're saying, oh my God, you're now going to turn my child into some sort of psychological guinea pig because, because if they believe, if they're wedded to the narrative that something terrible has happened when the child has been in the care of the other parent, if that's their truth, their belief, then of course anything, examination or therapy, is for them an anathema. So I think therein lies the problem. How do you convince the parent who's highly anxious that this is good scaffolding? This is the start of bridge building.
Um,
How do you get them to let go, Dee-vna?
yeah, look, I've had some success and I've had some failures. It kind of
Yeah.
is going to depend. But I do want to just go back to something that you both kind of commented on, allegations of different types of abuse. One thing that's really difficult is it's hard to ascertain when when that is true and when it's not true. So I think things like running lovingly doesn't necessarily mean that sexual abuse hasn't taken place. We know that can quite often be the case, particularly in kind of more, we've had a big daycare case up here, and the children would love the daycare provider that engaged in these, or allegedly engaged in these things. So the challenge is that children don't always present the way that adults would expect
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
those difficult situations. So just a caveat on my comments that it's best to try and maintain relationships is in those cases where there's not substantiated or highly likely situations of abuse, but we know that some parents do fabricate things as well, which is another problem.
Or they literally get a thin skein of fabric around a story that then the child and the parent together, and I'm not saying they deliberately concoct. I often, when I was acted as an independent children's lawyer, I would often act for well-intended parents who did care for their children. They both wanted the best outcome for the child, but then an allegation gets made, and the allegation grows legs, and the allegation grows arms, and it gets a ring of veracity around it. And it can often be a number of influences in the child's life that gets mashed together into a report. And the report can be, suddenly I'm the center of attention. Suddenly I'm getting this absentee parent who's meant to be loving me is really focused on me as I deliver a narrative that might have come from stories from school. It might have been something I'd been exposed to. It might have been something I saw online or TV, but I've packaged it in a way that this hungry parent has started to gobble up. And we've actually seen the hungry parent say, I now no longer believe that my child has been the victim of sexual abuse at the hands of my former partner. I've had a terrible journey through a court system where I believe that this reporting was not in fact based on reality. So it's a terrible journey for children to go on. If you think about it, we've got capacity, we've got a degree of resilience. We are not quite masters of our own destiny because we have to defer to the courts and judges and lawyers, but at least we are the adults in the scenario. Imagine the child going through that whole reporting process to then be examined, to then perhaps you've got child welfare, social welfare. You might have interviews by police. You might have a physical examination. You might have a number of psychologist reports whereby you have to, as a child, drag up what it was that you said. So it is a horrible journey for a parent to go on, but I think we as adults need to stop and think, if it's horrible for us, how much worse is it for children?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really difficult. I mean, the whole process is difficult for children, as you know, let alone when you've got parents make allegations against other parents and things like that. It really kind of makes me wonder whether there's anything we can do better before we even get to this situation. So, I know there's one P positive parenting program about co-parenting through separation and divorce that focuses on getting parents on the same page, having some shared goals, developing their kind of new family structure and things like that. And I just think it's such a shame that those kind of preventative or early intervention stuff don't seem to be used. Why are they not things that as soon as you first approach the law, what do I need to do to get in place for separation? Is that something lawyers talk to parents about, or not really?
Put it this way, the right sort of lawyers who have the right sort of training will always encourage parents not to press the court button. And it's compulsory. So a form of mediation is compulsory. A form of therapy is not necessarily compulsory. But if you package it to a client, lawyers have enormous power. We have but it is, with enormous power comes enormous responsibility. So if a lawyer can be that positive person for change and create best possible outcomes, then that's who we need to be. And I know Darren and I are committed, because we work very closely with therapists to ensure that parents actively explore, is there a better way of doing this? Can we get onto the same page? Have we got something wrong here? Do we need some structure? And the best sort of therapy that I've seen that works in that separation space is when the parents have to relearn how to be parents, and they have to approach it together, separated. And you can literally take the most dysfunctional family in the heat of litigation, and you can in fact redirect them. And I've seen it because I've got, Darren and I have a couple of what I like to think of as secret parenting weapons, where these very good therapists just say, enough of this nonsense now. We're going to go on a journey. This is what the journey is. This is what it entails. I don't need to meet your children. I need to meet the two of you. We need to get you singing on the same song sheet. And again, I'm not talking about serious allegations of family violence. I'm not talking about allegations of sexual abuse. I'm talking about where parents have got it wrong, if that makes sense. And we've seen great results, haven't we, Darren?
Absolutely. Yeah. I love these sessions because I love listening to Caroline, what she's got to say about her practices, but also our special guests like yourself, Dee-vna. But as Caroline's talking, I'm thinking, and you mentioned the Triple P course, I mean, why is it when babies are born, say within 12 months, the parents undergo some sort of parenting course, and a portion of that course could relate to conflict and its impact on children developmentally? Wouldn't that be a great idea?
Yeah,
Because we get babies from all different demographics, from all different cultures, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember the most scary experience is putting that baby in the capsule after the hospital time's over, and thinking, oh my God, what do we do with this now? I mean, it's scary enough when you get an animal, which, our animals, Caroline and ours, is treated like kids anyhow. But when you get a human being and you think, oh my God, what do I do with this? Like, there's no manual. There's no manual. And I often think if parents actually knew really early on how conflict impacts a child, whether it's at a separated household or a household that's nuclear. I often wonder whether that might be a really good preventative measure.
Look,
And Dee-vna, once upon a time, seatbelts weren't worn in cars. So how is this different? This is, you're putting a mental seatbelt on parents to say, care first, safety first for that child,
Parents need to belt up.
behavior.
They need to belt up.
Yeah. I mean, this is actually something that the government is already implementing. So we know at a national level that positive parenting has beneficial impacts on parent practices. It has beneficial impacts on child behaviour, and of course, they interact with each other. But also, when they rolled out there's a new paper coming out later this year from an Australian version. But when you roll out P positive parenting programs, you actually see reductions in substantiated child maltreatment and out-of-home placements and things like that. And that's because there are these preventative effects. If you see parents early enough and you can get them engaging in positive parenting practices, you get them building those positive relationships, you tell the child that you're loved and valued and you encourage good behavior, you see the benefits in the child. And then there's flow-on benefits for the parents as well. So I 100% think it would be a fantastic thing that it's rolled out. The government's made online P free for all parents across Australia, and a baby version as well has just been rolled out. But I would like to see that expanded. Speaking on someone's being on my door, I'd love to see that expanded. But I think it would make a difference at a within systems and things like that if they could do those conflict management. Because let's face it, parenting is hard. And you're not going to be on the same page. You are going to disagree about things. And even when your, mental capacity is good, you're happy and satisfied in life, it's still hard. There's still going to be times when you lose it. So there's no parent that's perfect. And if you kind of pull back every single thing that a parent's ever done, there's going to be plenty of fodder for the courts. Well, what we have to kind of focus on are what are the big pictures and what are the pieces that are actually going to impact child outcomes, and what are the ones that we can probably let go of a little bit.
Yeah.
And Dee-vna, on that point, I think I can feel part 2 of our conversation coming up later this year. So for now, Dee-vna Haslam, I just want to thank you so much for being a guest on today's program. Darren, last thoughts?
Last thoughts would be early intervention is the best medicine, I think.
Yeah, parenting is scary. So all the help you can get, P positive parenting, I think it's definitely the way to go. And on that note, Dee-vna, thank you so much for being our guest. Darren, always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks to the viewers of Done and Dusted.
Thank you.